Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 3 of Misfits. For the channel, a lot of people are just like, okay, this is weird. Like, he just dropped this in on us and whatever. But really, I just noticed that Misfits Season 2 just took off. So I can't, like, ignore something that is doing well and just saying, like, oh, well, I should probably just no longer go and continue that journey of that show. Plus, I actually liked it, and I wanted to see what the conclusion was from the cliffhanger of season 2 going into season 3. So, season 3, it seems that the writers bizarrely want more of a challenge for themselves. They want to give all these characters all brand new powers, but every single one of the powers are just lame duck-like powers. If I didn't make fun of that before in other seasons, like now there's some real lame duckish-like power where I'm just like, man, now, like, instead of, like, basically instead of, like, making the show more and more difficult, or, like, instead of, like, having these people with better powers to put against more challenging villains. No, it seems like they're going to still say like the same kind of thing throughout. They're going to still stay the same kind of show. And I'm like, well, that's just kind of disappointing. Like, so it's kind of like the show kind of went back to the drawing board, even though there's still stories hanging out there. Like, we still have Simon and his practicing of parkour to eventually become this hooded individual. Like, really, we just kind of, like, are staying the exact same kind of momentum for the show, and I'm just waiting for there to be a big, massive threat for these people to go up against, and there's no way for them to have, like, a good enough power to take this thing down. Like, it doesn't make a rational thing for me to just say, like, oh yeah, like, I can definitely feel like things are gonna, like, turn around now. Like, and, like, we're just gonna, like, get these characters to just, like, what if they were to have fought off the villain at the end of season 2 in season 3? There would be no way in my mind I could have said that they could have beaten that villain with these lame duck-like powers. But we'll see. We'll see what happens with these characters, because they introduced the character from the last season called Seth, and he's still in this season, the guy who is to kind of trade off people's powers. So we'll see where they eventually go further on into that. Plus, also, we're kind of waiting when Simon is going to make that time jump like he had previously said in Season 2. So, going on into this episode, I liked how they introduced new characters. Ruby seems to be a Rudy. Rudy? Yeah, Rudy. There's a D there. Rudy is to be this new character that has this goofy power, and really we're just having him, like, consistently say, hey, I'm the new guy, don't hurt me, I'm the new guy. Like I'm the new guy in this team. Plus, we don't know what everyone's power is. Like, we get little snippets of stuff of certain kind of characters. Like, I don't know what Simon's new power is, or if he just ultimately kept his power. I don't know, because, like, really, Simon has just been parkouring a lot. Like, we can maybe see that Simon might have the possible ability to see if he can, like, see his way ahead. Like, he has some kind of clairvoyance, maybe, where he can see if he is to fall or die or something ahead of time in his mind. But, like, that doesn't equal to time travel. That just is to, like, be a power that, again, just seems lame. But, like, like, I don't even know if exactly that's his actual power. That just might be him, like, putting the math together, just like, you know what, I don't think I'm ready to try this yet. So we'll eventually have to understand these characters' powers as it goes along. Uh, so this season is okay. Like, I eventually want a person with cool powers onto this team, or just a roster with cool powers, and so we're just not going to get that now. Uh, but eventually, I'm assuming at some point they're just going to have to, because all these people can only do community service for so long, and eventually they're probably going to have to forcibly change the roster of people. And maybe once we do that, eventually we'll be like, ooh, like, I like this character. But I'm hoping that the other people that are to be here will eventually still stay within the mix. But we'll see how this all plays out within this show. So yeah, we're going back to square one. Episode one is to focus on Rudy and some new cast members that won't last very long. Season two, or episode two, will be focused on uh, Curtis and his new power. Weirdly, in IMDb, season two said that there was an episode called Episode Zero, which I'm like, okay, I don't see that uh, on season two. That's weird. For Hulu. I don't know if it's on Tubi, but I don't know. So, episode three is to what is to go on episode two or episode three? Um, oh, episode three is to be kind of like a Simon Aisha kind of story, and it has a really interesting, cool villain in episode three. And then episode four is to mainly have this like weird time jump of a thing that is to just like, it's basically when uh, Nathan had gone back in time wanting to kind of correct what he had done, and it's kind of one of those kind of episodes where it's like we forcibly have Nathan, who ends up having to like go back and do exactly what he had done uh, beforehand. Um, so it's basically like one of those kind of episodes. It's not exactly like that, but it's pretty much the same. So let's go into it. Let's go into that double five time territory. Let's go into this thing called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we can do spoil these four episodes. So wait a minute. So I'm gonna cover the first four episodes, and then I'll cover the other four episodes. Like, I'm not gonna do them like tomorrow, but like I'll probably eventually do these like every other day to kind of see where the interest of people holds. And if season two was just a unique, beautiful snowflake, then like I eventually will probably just be like, well, okay, like, I guess don't do this show anymore. But that's just kind of sad, where it's just like, okay, well, like, I'm excited about going back into the show because like it seems people are interested, but then all of a sudden, like, that was just a unique one-time deal. So, but anyways, spoilers. So the very first episode is to really focus on Misfits, the new class, where we are to add in Rudy, who is to be this guy who can seamlessly shift into two different of the same person. So Rudy, at some points in time in this episode, is talking to himself, which, so Rudy is to have like the happy version of himself in one part of him, and then he splits, and the other part of him is to be this sad, depressed side uh, that eventually is to maybe try and hook up with the wrong kind of girl. We find out in this episode. So episode one. So it seems like they're are some people that ended up getting free from community service, but they wind up just eventually going right back into doing community service because it's the show. These people consistently have to keep getting in trouble and have to consistently keep going into community service. So they might as well just go off and like kill somebody or some kind of heinous crime because like they're gonna have to just keep coming in here for whatever reason. Because it seems like these people just can't get out of this community service. Like, how long are they going to stretch out this whole community service deal? Like, it's going to get ridiculous. But whatever. So in this episode, we have Rudy, who is to be the new guy, and so eventually it seems he's hitting on some of the new girls that are to be in this community service, Charlie and Tanya. We eventually find out another version, the sad version of Rudy ends up hitting on Tanya, and then all of a sudden Tanya goes back to the bar to see Rudy going and making out with Charlie, and then so she ends up getting upset, and we end up finding out what her power is. So, uh, so yeah, so yeah, so Rudy eventually goes and is to do community service, and it seems like things are going well. And so, and eventually he's trying to hit on Charlie, and that's not going to work out. So eventually they go to a bar, and Rudy is still trying to get with this girl like it's no tomorrow. And eventually he just talks to her enough where eventually it does work out. But then eventually Rudy goes to the bathroom and splits into two and is to talk to his sadder version of himself. And so eventually Rudy goes off to talk to Tanya and is to just kind of butter her up. But then again, Tanya eventually goes back to the bar and sees that Rudy is to make out with this girl, and so we find out that Tanya's power is the ability to stop time, and so Curtis is going and giving Rudy a bottle, and so Tanya goes and takes the bottle from Curtis, smashes this bottle onto Rudy's head, and then walks off and then restarts time. And so Rudy ends up going with Charlie after this whole situation, and excuse me. And so he ends up having, of course, sex with her and whatever. And it seems like he's so proud that eventually she's a girl that likes to take it up the butt for whatever reason. He goes on and on about that, how it's just like the key to a woman's heart is through her butt or something like that. Or it's like he's so happy that this girl is to just be wanting to take it up the butt for whatever reason. So eventually, since things didn't exactly work out where, because now Tanya is still having to forcibly be with with Rudy doing this community service, she gets more and more upset. And so eventually Tanya is to talk to Rudy while they're doing community service, and so Tanya is like, well, why did you lie to me? Why did you tell me all that stuff to like sweet talk to me? And Rudy's like, dude, I didn't talk to you. I talked to her. Like I was sweet talking her. I was continually being with her so I can get it up the butt. And so Tanya just gets even more frustrated to the point of her like stopping time again to toss Rudy down these flight of stairs. And so it seems that both Curtis Kelly and I think Simon, or maybe it was Aisha. Maybe it was Kelly, Curtis, and Aisha. All saw eventually Rudy falling down these flight of stairs because evidently this girl has a stopping time bubble, but I guess it's only for a certain kind of point. So it seems that Rudy falling down the stairs didn't really hurt him all that much. And so now, since this group had seen Tanya go and toss this guy down a flight of stairs, Tanya is to eventually see a police car, and so she stops time again, tosses a rock into this police car, and gives all of these group of people all rocks, starts time again, and so the police are after these characters, and so now all these people are running off, and so we now end up seeing what Curtis's power is that he can change into a girl, which I'm like, wow, what a real interesting power. Why couldn't he have just turned invisible? Like, invisible would be a cool power to do. You can do a lot of things with invisible, but now you have. But I guess that's technically what Simon did, technically, but still, you know. So, Curtis turns into a girl named Melissa, and I'm just like, okay, sure. Goofy powers, here we come. So, uh, so eventually everyone is to luckily run off and not all get arrested. And so Rudy is now angry at Tanya for what she had done. And so he decides to try and get back at her by eventually taking this one statue or something from Sean's table and putting it into Tanya's locker and getting back at her for what she had done. So what ends up happening is Tanya is thinking it's like, well, I can probably stop time and and then stop all this from happening. But Rudy is like, ha ha ha, like, I've already told this to Sean that you stole this, and he's already getting the statue. So like, you're gonna be in worse off paying girly than you are. Like, don't mess with me. And so the cops are being called. Tanya ends up being put into this one police car. And so Tanya ends up stopping time, getting out of the police car and running off, but she's going to get back at Rudy for sure. So eventually, what ends up happening is that Tanya gets back at Rudy by eventually having both Rudy and Charlie just kind of making out in this locker room. Tanya stops time to have Rudy be stabbing Charlie in the chest, and we have Aisha, who ends up kind of accidentally finding Rudy doing this because I think Tanya or I think Aisha still has like community service that I think she still has to do for whatever reason. So or no, wait, maybe she just kind of shows up and's like, hey, like, how's it going? Because we end up finding out that Rudy is to have a connection with Aisha because they used to be former lovers, and I guess she was there to kind of get some kind of like, hey, can I talk to you kind of moment. And she kind of bumps into this whole situation. Because eventually, Rudy is to eventually go on and try to uh, like work through the fact that him and her used to be lovers, but whenever Rudy used to see Aisha, all of a sudden the other version of him ends up popping out. And so when Aisha is to be at this bar, Rudy uncontrollably separates between the two of him, and then Charlie's like, "What? Like, who was I sleeping with? Like, who was I getting it on with? Like, what's going on here? I'm so confused." And so they end up eventually finding out Rudy's power that he can duplicate. And so, like, it would be interesting if Rudy would have separated even more so, like, to have, like, multiple different versions of himself. But, like, I guess, like, two is good enough, right? For whatever reason. So, eventually, Rudy is to go home to find an old picture of Aisha and to mention that they used to, like, again be lovers. And so Rudy just gets to the point where things are working out so well with Charlie that Rudy just wants to separate with his other self. That he doesn't want the sad version of himself to hanging around him because he like just wants to be nonstop happy all the time. So this guy needs to just bugger off. And so it seems like he was going to do that. So now we get back to Rudy possibly stabbing Charlie and killing her off. So now Tanya is to spot Aisha and stop time yet again to eventually get both nooses for Rudy and Aisha and hang them upside down to where now they are to be forced to be kind of dangling onto these chairs. And so eventually this forces these characters now to kind of make amends about things and to say that Aisha kind of like lied to Rudy and like they kind of make amends here and then they just come back to being friends again. But Rudy ends up going and is to start to have his chair fall. He ends up falling over, and so he's just kind of hanging it out. And so eventually Rudy grabs onto Aisha's like legs. Then Aisha is starting to dangle there, and so that's when they kind of have this one moment out. Rudy just wants to know about like them just kind of talking about their relationship, and then once they're done with that, Rudy just decides that he's like, okay, well, I'm going to let go because that's all I ever really wanted was that last bit of closure. So Rudy is to come to finding out that the other version of himself came back for him because he couldn't leave. And so both of them are okay. And so we also had a moment where Kelly was going to Seth and to ask Seth to try to get rid of Tanya, like do something with this girl's power. And Seth is like, dude, I'm not like a policeman. I'm not a power policeman. I'm not gonna like forcibly like take anyone's powers away who's not using them properly. That's not what Seth is to do here. But it seems like Kelly is to consistently hang around and to be with Seth, and she gets to the point in these 4 episodes where she is to just kind of continue to stalk him, like find out that that she can help him with her rocket science power, where she's to have this knowledge of technology. Like at first they end up saying that it's a rocket science like kind of knowledge, but then they end up kind of like changing it or shifting it to just say that she like knows a lot about technology and she can easily figure things out, which I thought was so stupid because I don't like that power. Like, because it's like, man, you really have to write that power. You really have to figure out how you can use that power to the best of its benefit. And that's a lot of work to have to just waste on a power that's really not that good enough. Like, I could see if it was just, like, she had, like, a huge IQ and could just MacGyver everything into a scenario where she could easily come up with an escape plan for everything, or which I could see how that, like, how she could even intelligently, like, talk her way out of things, like, but not just be a rocket scientist where, like, she's not, like, she's just going to be able to just know tech things and that's it. But that's just me, I guess. So, but yeah, so Kelly starts hanging out with Seth, eventually fixes his car, eventually follows him to this grave site where she's to find out that he is to have a former lover that evidently died. And, like, that's kind of a bulk of what happens through, like, the first 3 episodes. Episode 4 is to be this whole time jump thing where they have a lot of focus just on that. So like, there's kind of slivers of story of what Kelly's going on with. Uh so eventually what ends up happening is they, of course, figure out how to just kill Tanya, because that's all that they can really just do. Like, they have to, like, eventually kill Tanya. And then, so they bury Charlie and Tanya's bodies, as well as they normally just bury everybody. And so now they're driving off, and we end up finding out that supposedly Rudy is driving in a stolen car. So now everybody that's in the car is going to have to forcibly go back and do community service again. And so now Sean is now, like, clapping, and he's just like, hey, you guys are back because you're stupid. And so now everybody's back to doing community service again, which was just dumb. So in the second episode, we have a Curtis-focused episode because we now have to devote an entire episode to Curtis changing genders into Melissa and him going to Aisha as his previous lover and mention, like, hey, was I really good at, like, having, like, was I really good with you? Like, was I really a good lover? Like, was I, like, eventually, like, Aisha would touch Curtis and then they would, like, bang it out. So, like, Curtis now is to ask Aisha, like, hey, was I good to you? And Aisha was just like, no. Like, not really. Like, because if anything, supposedly he focused too much on him instead of her and all that rigmarole. So, uh, so Curtis is deciding to go and be guy by night and girl by day, because Curtis is wanting to go and run track again. So he decides if he's a different person, then he can go ahead and run track. So Melissa is to go and do these tryouts, and everybody's like, wow, this Melissa, she's really good. And so they offer her this kind of track thing. And so Melissa eventually meets up with this girl named Emma. I want to say it's Emma. Let's go into episode 2. Oh, of course. We gotta slow this down. Oh, crap. Let me pause here for a second. All right. So Melissa is to meet this girl named Emma. It also seems like Curtis is trying to kind of talk to Emma to just be like, yeah, well, I want, like, Emma to fall in love with the real me, who is technically Curtis and not Melissa. But it seems that Emma is eventually more and more finding Melissa much more attractive than Curtis. And I'm just like, but they're the same person. They're the same person. So when or when Curtis is to be Melissa, like everyone is to really just hit on her. Like Sean is really weirdly, uh, like running alongside her and like hitting on her, and Melissa's like, I don't want anything to do with you. And so eventually later on, uh, when they're in the club, eventually we have Rudy who is to also hit on Melissa. And then when Melissa is to get drugged, Rudy takes advantage of her. So, anyways, so pushing on. Uh, so we end up finding out that seemingly the track and field coach guy is to seemingly have his eyes on certain girls, to where we eventually find out that these girls eventually end up getting drugged and being put into the back of this guy's car, and he takes advantage of them. And so, uh, like at first, that ends up being that uh, Mark tries to take advantage of Melissa, but Melissa ends up waking up and overpowering Mark. And so Mark eventually, when he sees Melissa again, like Mark is trying to be like all apologetic about it, like hopefully like you won't tell anybody about this, blah 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 blah. So then eventually Mark goes after Emma towards the tail end of this episode, and then eventually we have Curtis, who ends up kind of saving the day, knowing full well like he is used to like seeing Mark kind of going after women, so this has to eventually stop. And eventually Curtis takes and puts Mark into this trunk and is to try and humiliate him. So let's a little bit. So eventually Simon is to find out that Melissa is Curtis, because Melissa is to be going through Curtis's locker, and so Simon is like, excuse me, like that's Curtis's locker. And so Melissa's like, well, that's because I am Curtis. And Simon's like, no, really? And so Melissa's like, yeah. And so he's like, oh, okay. Uh so eventually Curtis is to tell, because eventually Emma is to just really just grow really attracted to Melissa, and so Emma ends up going down uh, on Melissa, and so Curtis the very next day tells Simon about his female O moments, let's just say. And Curtis is to mention how like men get this like short burst of an O moment, where women they get to like have it build for hours and hours and hours, or just have it to be able to build for multiple times and whichever. And so like it seems that Curtis has started to get the female perspective of things, and maybe is eventually going to become a better lover, I guess, to possibly put the other person first, I guess. I don't know. We'll figure that out. So eventually, what ends up happening within this episode to kind of cause a bunch of chaos. So, uh, so Emma and Melissa going out together, going clubbing, and so what ends up happening is Melissa ends up getting drugged to be taken advantage of, and all of a sudden, like Rudy is to take advantage of uh, Melissa while she's kind of really just either I think she's drunk or she's drugged. I don't remember which. And so Emily finds Melissa kind of uh, going and having oral, of course, with Rudy, and so she now runs off and wants to break up with Melissa because it's like, hey, like you're having like you're going and just kind of playing all around, playing with all kinds of men, and so eventually Melissa is to try and make up for that, but then eventually Emma is to go into Melissa's room again later on to find Curtis there, and so Melissa or Emma's just like, man, Melissa really gets around. And then Curtis then has to forcibly take Emma and just be like, no, you don't understand. Like, I have this power of changing from male to female. And then, like, so Curtis finally has to spell it out to Emma, and she's like, oh, so that whole entire time was all just like a whole huge mix up. And so, like, it eventually seems that we don't carry on with this relationship past this episode. Uh, so I was really just like, okay, so like that whole thing was just to waste a chunk of time to just have Curtis really play out this episode for them to have something to do. And I just felt like it was a waste. I felt like episode 2 is a giant, massive waste where eventually they have this like weird storyline, and yeah, so it was kind of like a weird, creepy storyline that I didn't enjoy. So, like, in all honesty, I went and I watched episode 2 before, and then I just went back and just kind of watched the cliff notes of episode 2 because I just hated episode 2. Like, it was just a waste of time episode, and I was like, why did they have to focus so much on Curtis for one episode just to have this relationship that doesn't progress to episode 3? And also there was this creepy episode where a guy was drugging women and taking advantage of them. I'm like, this guy didn't really have like much of a real legitimate power, but okay, whatever. So pushing on. Um, and I know that people could easily just say it's like, well, like they put that episode in there for a reason, because really it's just to like to eventually have like, oh, like this can happen in every day-to-day life, and we have to kind of tell this kind of story. I don't know, it's just wasn't a good episode. So pushing on. So episode 3 is to be like, I actually like the villain in this story. The villain is actually really cool. I like this. So Simon is to consistently go and practice his parkour if he hasn't done that through a number of other episodes. And so Simon is doing his parkour practice to eventually find out that he has to be Daredevil for a moment here. Because there's to be this guy who is to be kind of be this person who's kind of mugging this kid. And so Simon jumps in and is to try and stop this whole mugging situation. And the thug guy ends up crushing Simon's hand, but then eventually Simon is to eventually scare this guy off. And so Peter is like, oh, thank you, man. Like, hey, you must be some kind of superhero. So, hey, let me take a picture with you. And so Simon runs off, and so the guy like can't take the picture, the guy named Peter. And so what ends up happening is Peter eventually ends up in community service, because evidently he decided that he wanted to steal this girl's purse just to give it back to her, to look like some hero, making up some story that he had found this thief of this girl's purse and to try to be the hero of the story, but it didn't work out. So we seem to have like a new cluster of people coming in, but it seems that that all these people like don't carry on. I think from the next episode, like these people aren't the another new batch of new people. So uh, really, what ends up happening is Peter is to eventually go into the locker room of this spot, and Simon is to also go in there also to go and pee, and so all of a sudden Peter is to see the kind of messed up hand that Simon is to have, and then Peter's like, "Oh my God, like you must be the vigilante because like that was the same hand that got hurt from whatever," and so Simon ends up saying like, "Well, yeah, don't tell anybody." Because he sounds just like the vigilante too. So Peter's just like, "Oh my God, like you're a superhero," and so what ends up happening is we are to find out what Peter's power is. So we find out that Peter's power is that he is to draw these comic books, and whatever he is to draw within these comic book panels comes to life. Like, so we have these people who are forced to do this kind of story and play it out exactly the way Peter wants it to because they have no choice. So eventually, Peter is to hang out with Simon, and so Peter forces Simon to kind of show him everything, and like Peter quickly becomes best friends with Simon, and because Peter forces Simon to, and then when Aisha is to kind of ask Simon like, "Hey, who's that guy there?" Simon is like, "Well, like me and him are new friends. Like me and him are gonna hang out together as long as like me and you don't have plans." And Aisha's like, "No, I'm just gonna go and hang out with my friends too," even though she doesn't have anybody, sadly enough. So, but I think she eventually ends up hanging out with Kelly maybe in this episode. Anyways, pushing on. So Peter and Simon hang out, and so Simon takes Peter to their headquarters and shows him the vigilante gear, and like we also had a moment in one of these episodes where Rudy is to make his way to their headquarters also, and when eventually he bumps into Aisha, that's when he starts to get sick and runs off. But then the second time he ends up bumping into Aisha, like it forces his double to come out in the bar. And so like Rudy knows his headquarters just like Peter knows his headquarters, but we'll find out what happens with Peter in this episode. So so Peter is to again panel this story to the way of which that Simon is to show Peter everything, tell him all of his secrets and whatever, and and Aisha is to come in and is to just be upset because of what Simon has done to like show this kid everything, and Simon is like, "Well, he's kind of my friend," and so let me just reset here for a second. So all of a sudden we also have Simon who basically told Peter like everything about like his future self, and that eventually he's to go back in time to save this girl and take a bullet for her and everything. And so Peter is just seemingly want to be just like Simon and is to eventually try and come up with a tweaked variation of Simon's vigilante, because I guess he just wants to desperately be just like Simon, because evidently he can't make a world for himself. I guess nothing really quite works out, or what works out quite long enough, right? Because there's only so much paper in the world for this guy to make up his own world, or to eventually find something and it work out perfectly. So he has to kind of storyboard this reality for himself. So eventually what ends up happening is that Aisha is just trying to get really irritated with Peter, and like it seems that Aisha is just like, you know what, you should probably just stop hanging out with this guy, because like we don't know if we can really trust him. So Simon eventually goes on this rant dumping Aisha, like saying that his like him being a hero is far too important to like be with her right now, and he is to talk about this in like some kind of dialogue that seems very superhero comic booky ish. And so he ends up walking off from Aisha, and so what eventually happens is later on Aisha ends up bumping into Peter, and so all of a sudden, like, things start to go flying, and so while she's to start like picking things up, she starts to thumb through things, realizing that uh, that Peter's sketches are to look like Simon, and she's like, "Okay, like, are you seriously sketching Simon? Like, that seems weird." And then all of a sudden, she ends up finding this whole panel where Simon wants to say that dialogue that he had said to Aisha, and Aisha's like, "Oh my god, like, are you seriously, is this your power? Are you controlling people?" And Peter just runs off, and so Aisha goes to the rest of the group, and she's like, "Okay, we have another person we have to handle now. We have to figure out how to like get this guy to stop doing what he's doing because it's wrong." So eventually they figure out where this guy lives, and so eventually what ends up happening is this group ends up going and breaking this guy's like alarm system, which of course Kelly has the technology to be able to do. And the technology kind of thing, we end up having at some point where like Kelly goes and builds this one rocket for these people, but she has no credentials. So they're like, "Dude, like, I can't believe that you put this whole thing together and helped us out." And Kelly's like, "Well, yeah, of course I did." It's like, and so eventually they're not buying it, and so Kelly like can't make money off this thing because there's no real proof that she was able to do this. And so like Kelly's like, "God, I don't know why people can't buy me as a rocket scientist. Like, should I like get a fake pair of glasses so I can look smarter? Like, what do I need to do?" So so that was kind of funny. So after the whole paper ripping up scenario, eventually Simon is to seemingly come back to normal and realize, he's like, "Oh my god, I didn't realize that I said all those things to you." And he says all this to Aisha. He's like, "This was such a huge mistake. I didn't want to like do all the things that I did, but I had no control." And Aisha's like, "You know what? It's perfectly okay. We figured it out. Blah 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 blah." So, but eventually there still has to be another showdown to be had. So, uh, so eventually what ends up happening is Peter is to control Simon to fight for him, because eventually the group is to go after Peter, and Simon just drops down and is within comic panels beating up this whole entire group. And then we kind of cue back to them all falling onto the ground hurt. And that's when we have Rudy, who's like, "Hey, like, why did he beat up me? I'm the new guy. I'm the new kid in town. Like, what the heck?" So eventually they uh, to get to the point again where it really just has to forcibly become a showdown between both Peter and Simon, because Peter decides that he is to go and uh, kidnap Aisha uh, with his red and black version of uh, Simon's getup, and then he leaves Simon this kind of note of something like, "Hey, meet me at this place here at this time," and whatever. So Simon goes on to face Peter. And so what ends up kind of playing out is that Simon ends up stabbing Peter, and Peter has this stretch of comic book dialogue again. And so then Aisha is like, "Okay, you can never wear this outfit again. Like, you need to burn this outfit and, like, never do this thing again." And so Simon goes and gasolines Peter and burns his body, but he ends up taking the outfit and, like, sneaking it behind his locker and holding it there without Aisha knowing, so that way he has that outfit to eventually go back in time. And because Aisha is like, "You are never going to travel back in time, because if you travel back in time, that's you dumping me. So you're not going to go back in time." Because him going back in time means that he is going to die for Aisha. So, like, she's going to have to forcibly live on without him, which we can understand that is eventually going to happen, because eventually they're probably just going to recast any number of these people anyways. It's bound to happen. So eventually we find out that Peter had scripted this whole big battle on his walls. And so what you were to have thought was just this normal play out scenario, whatever. Still, Peter, before he was to die, was to scribble out this one story of how this was all going to play out. So Peter still used his power to control these people's lives, but I guess still we were to enjoy the whole, like, fun part of this, which was to have a comic book powered character or person that could draw things. And, like, we end up having that quite frequently through, like, stuff like Haven and stuff like that. So what is episode 4? So episode 4 is to weirdly we end up finding out where Curtis's power had gone to. And so Curtis' power, of course, if people don't remember, was him having the ability to, most of the time he ends up going back for, like, X amount of hours or a certain kind of day. But it seems that there was to be this this old man who is to be Friedrich, or Friedrich, who is to seemingly go back in time decades, because he wants to try and prevent Hitler from being Hitler. So Frederick goes back in time to stop Hitler, and what ends up happening is that Hitler ends up stabbing Frederick, because Frederick isn't strong enough to really fight Hitler. And then Frederick is to drop his phone, and Hitler gets this future technology of this phone to supposedly win the war that he was involved in. And so now all of a sudden, in the most present time, when Frederick is to go back to present time, he finds out that the Nazis are like controlling this world, and that Germany had won the war, and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, like, everybody is to have like swastikas on them one way or another, and so this story is to mostly be carried by Seth, the guy that can kind of trade powers. So Seth is to be imprisoned by these people. So it's not like community service for the most point now. It's basically just people are being held in jail cells, and there's certain people that instead of becoming community service members, they end up becoming guards. Like Aisha ends up becoming like a person that is working for Sean, and Simon ends up becoming a guard for this rebellion, and or for Sean's people. Like Simon ends up becoming a guard for Sean, and Curtis is to be a part of this rebellion, as well as Kelly's to be part of this rebellion, and Rudy is just to, I guess, also be a part of the rebellion. So it eventually we have Captain Smith, who is to kind of come in and kind of throw his weight around against Sean, and so eventually there's to be a trading off of power where Seth takes power from a girl named Lily, and then Seth gives that power to Captain Smith. And so Captain Smith has this freezing ability to where he is to touch somebody and to freeze them to kill them off. And so now they're seeing Seth as this like huge like kind of thing that they can use against any number of people. And so they're trying to shield and protect Seth from anybody. So Curtis is to eventually give Kelly this poison to put into Seth's oatmeal for him to eat it and for Seth to die off. Because, like, hey, we can't have a person have this kind of power. That does not seem right. And so what ends up happening is we end up having the old man who's kind of just stabbed, and he's just kind of waiting to die. Simon is to mention that, like, hey, this old man is getting infected, so I want to go and try to help him by getting some antibiotics. And so he ends up bumping into Aisha, where he's just like, oh, hey, I'm just getting these antibiotics for this guy. And Aisha's just like, fine, go ahead and do it. And so all of a sudden, Sean, like, kind of walks into the office. And so we have Aisha that's trying to desperately cover for Simon. And so Simon gets the antibiotics and gets out of there and gives it to this old man. And so the old man is to tell Fredericks is to tell Simon, it's like, hey, this isn't the way the future should have gone, and blah, blah, blah. So eventually Fredericks is to have knowledge about another timeline where none of this had happened, and that Germany didn't win. And so Fredericks eventually decides to give his power to Seth because Seth is much younger. And so Fredericks tells Simon, it's like, hey, make sure, like, you stop me from doing what I'm doing, or make sure that you like at least try to get that cell phone away from Hitler's clutches. Uh, so that way he doesn't get future technology. So what ends up happening is that we get a spot where Captain Smith is now like figuring out that Seth has the time traveling power. And so Captain Smith is wanting to have Seth go and give this power away to someone and have that person be killed off. And that ends up being Curtis because Sean in the Nazi army that he's with goes and finds out that Curtis and his people are all these rebellious people, and so they go and they grab all these people, toss them in these prison cells, and so now Captain Smith is to tell Seth to give this power to Curtis. I'm like, oh, so he's gonna get the power back and like reset this whole thing to where Curtis is gonna have this power again. But no. What ends up happening is Captain Smith immediately shoots Curtis to where it's like, okay, so is that power gone? I highly doubt that. And so Captain Smith is thinking that this whole thing is resolved, so Captain Smith walks off to eventually have Kelly go and break everyone out. And so while they're trying to try to take down some Nazis, eventually they get stuck into this one room, and because Seth is now shot, he decides to now go and transfer his power to Kelly through this kiss. And so now Kelly goes back in time to correct what this old man did, because evidently she could have easily figured out exactly where to go back to, because maybe there was some news report about this whole phone thing that she figured out about. So Kelly goes back and is to grab the phone from Hitler and to beat the crap out of him, kick him a couple times, and then go back to her current time where seemingly everything is all right with the world. Here's the funny thing, though. Like, we had some people who ended up coming back from this episode that ended up dying off fairly quickly in, I think, season 1. I think season 1. Where there was one guy that I'm like, oh my god, I remember him from, like, season 1. And he, I think, ended up getting killed off in this episode. But whichever. So Kelly goes back, and I'm like, okay, so is Kelly going to have the time-traveling power now? And we'll kind of keep this in the group somewhere? No. Kelly goes to Seth and is like, you know what? I have the time-traveling power, and in an alternate timeline, like, you and me kissed. And so Seth was like, well, like, the kiss, was it good? And Kelly's like, oh, it's all right. So Kelly decides that she doesn't want the time-traveling power, that she's messed with history enough, and that she wants Seth to hold on with this power. And Seth is like, okay, well, I'll just kind of have it, like, sparingly, but, like, I'll never use it or I'll never give it to anybody. So, because really just Kelly is to say that's like, well, I still want my rocket scientist power back, and because she likes having that. And so it's like, okay, like, she doesn't even trade up for a better power. Oh, what was Aisha's power? Because that happened in the one episode where she was to be hung by that noose. So Aisha's power is that she can see through other people's eyes. Like, she can basically go into other people's bodies and see through their bodies. So she was to know where Tanya was, like that Tanya was writing some note, some suicide note for supposedly both Aisha and Rudy, and she ended up also figuring out where Simon was, I think, at some point. Or maybe it was either Peter or Simon at some point. But anyways, so uh, really that's all that like happened in episode 4, and it was kind of like a letdown kind of an episode. But oh well. I kind of rushed through a lot of these episodes, like especially episode 2. I was like, I don't even want to talk about episode 2. It was just not a good episode. Like there's some really good ones here because they're like there's certain episodes where they're kind of fun, but like I'm hoping that they don't stick with these powers. I hope that there comes a time when uh, they eventually trade back in these powers to eventually do something else, or eventually there's just a new group of batch of people that they focus on, and I would be okay with that because like if we're really gonna stick with these powers, I'm just gonna be like, no, I don't care for these powers. They suck. So I'm hoping we get some new characters in that I can enjoy because I've just invested with these characters, so like I can tolerate poor powers being put together. Like I think because I ended up watching the first 3 episodes and I never reviewed it just because I was like, God, these powers suck, and so I was kind of disinterested in the show. But it seems like this show is doing good enough to garner people's interest. So we'll see if people want to hear reviews about this show. But I think with that said, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go. Let me know your opinions about Misfits season 3 for these X amount of episodes. Let me know how you felt about them. Eventually, like if like it was funny, there was one person that ended up doing like spoilers for whatever because I have no real knowledge about certain XYZ things because I just kind of take with what I take. So if people have spoilers, don't put it down. Like if anything, people could justify it's like, oh yeah, he's like saying like about this group where he eventually just wants other people or they're just going to continue to focus on these people. You can let me know that. Like you can let me know like kind of certain things where I kind of had like I'm theory crafting and you can confirm things, but like don't really just give me spoilers of the show. Uh, but otherwise, I am justifiably getting the heck out of here so I can review something else on top of this. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Again, I doubt people are going to hang out through the whole hour. But if you do, thank you. I'm going to try to do part 2 fairly soon of season 3. So hang out for that because I'm going to hopefully keep doing these if it gets the clickety-click of views. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.